Steam from the samovars curled through the tea room at Tulip Hill like pale silk, carrying hints of orange Bacot and bergamot. Sunlight, fractured by beveled windows, scattered pinpricks of colour on linen-draped tables where porcelain cups clinked in civil conversation. The annual spring high tea promised delicate sandwiches, rhubarb clotted cream tartlets, and, chief attraction, dark-muscled truffles from Julien Laroche, the visiting chocolatier whose creations were rumoured to induce involuntary sighs. He had insisted on staging a spectacle, a waist-high Venetian glass fountain from which liquid chocolate cascaded in shimmering curtains. The fountain was stationed on a dais garlanded with blush-pink tulips, commanding the room like an edible altar. Grace Whitfield, Tulip Hill's etiquette instructor, wove between chairs correcting posture and whispering gentle reminders about napkin placement. Her silver hair was wound in a French twist, so precise it might have been measured with calipers. Grace believed manners were a kind of social glue, invisible yet indispensable. She also believed in contingency plans. Before guests arrived, she had supervised the kitchen staff, rehearsed the timing of courses, and discreetly stored a sewing kit in her beaded reticule should anyone's hem betray them. By 3 o'clock, conversation foamed as vigorously as the fountain. Grace stood beside Julien, studying the way women in floral dresses and men in linen suits surrendered to his truffles with half-shut eyes. Julian's accent flickered between Bordeaux and Birmingham, depending on whether he flirted or negotiated. He teased Grace, too, calling her Madame Règle, Madame Rules, but did so with a wink that suggested admiration rather than contempt. When the quartet began a lilting arrangement of Clair de Lune, Grace withdrew to the service corridor for a final sweep. She returned 5 minutes later, smoothing the lace at her wrists. Guests now ringed the fountain in a wider circle than before. A hush had fallen so abruptly the air seemed to contract. The reason revealed itself between 2 hats. Julien Laroche, face down in the basin, chocolate rippling around his motionless shoulders. The first scream came from Mrs. Caldwell, whose butter-yellow gloves flailed as though batting unseen bees. Cups shattered. Liquid chocolate splashed as a gentleman tried to haul Julien out and slipped, smearing his cream trousers with cocoa. Grace surged forward, voice low but urgent. "Step back, everyone. Allow space." Her pulse hammered, yet the cadence of command felt oddly familiar, like returning to a language she hadn't spoken in years. Within minutes, the town constabulary arrived, 2 officers whose uniforms smelled faintly of motor oil. While they sealed off the area and sent the shaken guests to the garden, Grace supervised the move to the orangery, where tea would continue because, she reasoned, occupying minds prevented hysteria. Even tragedy deserved structure. Through French doors, she glimpsed the officers lifting Julian's body, rich chocolate washing away to reveal pallid skin. A chill skittered down her spine. Chocolate fountains, she knew, circulated liquid at just above body temperature. Drowning was not impossible, but something felt off. Julien had been a confident, almost flamboyant man, hardly the sort to lean too far and topple in. Grace's reputation for composure preceded her, so Captain Maurice Havelock called her aside once the medical examiner departed. He unrolled a pocket notebook, thick fingers poised. "Madam Whitfield, you were the event supervisor. You'll have noticed anything irregular." She inhaled, summoning details. The fountain ran smoothly during setup. Julien checked the viscosity twice. He seemed, well, buoyant. Did he drink? 1 glass of champagne, less than most. Havelock's eyes were the colour of wet bark, attentive yet skeptical. Accidents plausible, but we've reason to suspect otherwise. Grace braced. Why? Traces of cyanide in his bloodstream. The floor shifted beneath her kitten heels. Cyanide. Even a veteran etiquette instructor had no instruction for poison. That night, Tulip Hill's guest suites thrummed with rumour. Grace retired to her apartment over the carriage house, poured herself an unladylike measure of brandy, and opened a notebook usually reserved for lecture drafts. As she outlined columns labelled motive, means, opportunity, a memory roused, another place of linen and light, a half-forgotten chapter when Grace had been seconded to Army intelligence during the Gulf War. She'd never discussed it. War stories stained white gloves. Yet skills honed decoding supply logs and cross-referencing troop movements might now serve a domestic battlefield. First, she listed all personnel with proximity to the fountain: Julian, the pastry chef Beatrice Ling, Marcel, Julian's junior assistant, Bernie Green, the facilities supervisor who filled the fountain's reservoir, and of course, herself. Among guests, several had clustered near the dais: Vivian Caldwell, heir to a biscuit fortune, Aldridge Fenwick, councilman, and Dr. Sandeep Mehra, botanist and avid gourmet. Plenty of possibilities, but motive remained elusive. At dawn, Grace walked Tulip Hill's kitchens. Stainless steel counters reflected fluorescent glare like ice. Beatrice Ling sat alone piping lemon curd onto macarons that would never be served. Her eyes were red-rimmed, her toque awry. Grace approached gently. "Beatrice, may I ask a few questions?" The chef nodded, fingers squeezing the pastry bag with mechanical precision. "Did Julian have enemies?" Beatrice snorted, a sound half cry, half laughter. "Julian had rivals, lovers, creditors, take your pick. But enemies?" She shook her head. "He was too charming to hate, too unreliable to trust," Grace jotted. "You knew him well?" "Worked for him in Lyon. He poached me from a patisserie, promised partnership, never materialized." "Resentful?" "Disappointed," Beatrice corrected. "But I wouldn't kill him. I was piping rosettes when he went for a sensory check," he said. "Alone?" "Yes. Marcel had gone to fetch sea salt. Bernie stayed to adjust the fountain's thermostat." Grace absorbed this. "Did Julian request anything unusual yesterday?" Beatrice paused. "He insisted on controlling the truffle plating personally, wouldn't let me or Marcel help after noon." "Why?" "Claimed a surprise encore for dessert." Grace's pen hesitated. In the corridor, she found Bernie Green replacing a light bulb, tool belt jangling. Bernie was Tulip Hill's taciturn handyman, built like a grandfather clock, tall, narrow, wood-coloured. She asked about the thermostat. "Fountain needed fine-tuning," he said. "Chocolate thickens if it drops below 31 degrees Celsius." "Did you leave Julian unattended?" "Nobody was in sight when I finished." Grace noticed a dark smear on Bernie's cuff, smelling faintly of almonds. Not chocolate's mellow bitterness, but sharper, chemical. Cyanide bore a bitter almond odour, or so crime novels claimed. She leaned in, the odour retreated. Perhaps imagination. Back in her apartment, Grace considered the almond scent. Poison typically entered the body through ingestion or injection. If Julian had planned a dramatic encore, he might have prepared special truffles, perfect vessels for cyanide. But why poison himself? Probability. He was murdered. She needed to examine any remaining truffles. They had been confiscated as evidence, but Tulip Hill's security office likely stored a photographic catalogue. Grace fetched her spare key and descended spiral stairs seldom used by guests. Archie Beaumont, the portly security chief, was cataloguing silverware. Grace's aura of authority, part grandmother, part headmistress, enabled access with minimal fuss. On the monitor, high-resolution images displayed each truffle, ebony domes brushed with copper luster dust. However, one photo arrested her attention. Among the domes sat a spherical chocolate painted with tulip petals, distinct and oversized. She zoomed. A sugar paste stem curled upward like a handle. Was that served? She asked Archie. Not sure. Julian guarded the plate till he, you know. Grace's fingertips tingled. A stranger to imprecision, she remembered the guest list. Vivian Caldwell collected limited edition confections. Aldridge Fenwick chaired the Tulip Hill Arts Fund. Dr. Mehra studied toxins in night-blooming plants. Any of them might have interest in a novelty truffle. But who received it? She strode to the orangery, where leftover table settings remained. On Vivian Caldwell's plate lay a copper smear. Aldridge's held crumbs of shortbread only. Dr. Mehra's plate, however, showed a faint ring of pink luster dust and a drop of dark chocolate alone. Perhaps Julian had offered him the tulip truffle as a scientific curiosity. Grace located Dr. Mehra in the library, scanning horticulture volumes. He wore spectacles with frames like slender vines, and his demeanor was one of perpetual contemplation. Dr. Mehra, Grace began, did Julian present you with a special truffle yesterday? He blinked, surprised. Yes, said it contained a rare spice from Sumatra. Asked me to taste it privately after the toast, as my expert palate would appreciate terroir variations. Mehra's brows knit. But then chaos erupted. I slipped it into my pocket to analyze later. Frankly forgot until this morning. He produced a waxed envelope. Inside rested the tulip petal truffle, unbitten. Grace's breath released. May I? He consented. Together they went to the kitchen, where Grace borrowed a paring knife. She bisected the truffle. Inside lay a hollow cavity holding a wafer-thin vial of opaque liquid. Not poison, information. Mehra whistled softly. Micro-test tube, pharmaceutical grade. Grace donned gloves and extracted the vial. A label, handwritten, read, 1954 Chambre Rose, BW. The initials sparked recognition. BW were hers. She staggered. In 1954, her father, Bernard Whitfield, had bottled a limited rose-infused cordial at Whitfield Distillery, the family business she had sold to finance Tulip Hill's refurbishment. Only one case remained undisclosed. Julian could scarcely own such a vial unless... Heart-racing, Grace remembered her last conversation with Julian 3 days earlier. He had praised Whitfield cordials and inquired about archival recipes. She'd assumed flattery. Now suspicion roared. Perhaps Julian intended to blackmail her, or share an heirloom, and someone intercepted the secret. Grace wiped her glasses. The vial was intact. The killer likely hadn't known of its existence. Motive redirected, not to silence Julian's secret, but maybe to steal it. Yet Dr. Mehra had the truffle unguarded overnight. No one came for it. Another path beckoned. She revisited the almond odour. Cyanide could derive from amygdalin extracted from apricot pits. In confectionery, apricot kernel paste, persipan, substituted for marzipan. If someone laced persipan with cyanide, shaped it, and dipped it in chocolate, the poison would integrate seamlessly. Who handled persipan regularly? The pastry chef. Grace faced an ethical cliff. Confront Beatrice without evidence or dig deeper. She opted for deeper and returned to the pastry kitchen that evening after staff departure. Lights were dim, but the prep refrigerator hummed. Inside, on a labelled tray, rested logs of marzipan and persipan. She pinched a sliver of persipan into a porcelain spoon and held it under her nose. Bitter almond, yes. Regular persipan hinted almond too, but this was fierce. She recognized the whiff from Bernie's cuff. So Bernie, not Beatrice, handled the doctored persipan. Means identified. But motive? She crept toward Bernie's maintenance alcove. Filing cabinets smelled of solvents and cedar oil. Inside a drawer she found invoices, fountain rental, thermostatic repairs, and a late notice bill from La Roche-Chocolat for €12,000 addressed to Tulip Hill CO Facilities Supervisor. Bernie had been footing Julian's supply charges? She scanned. At the bottom, a scribble, "Will settle after shares transferred." J.L. Bernie and Julian had a side deal. Perhaps Bernie invested in Julian's next venture, expecting shares in exchange for covering equipment. If Julian waffled, Bernie might resort to murder. Yet opportunity. Bernie adjusted the thermostat and could have slipped poison into the chocolate basin. Cyanide dissolved rapidly in fats, but what of ingestion? The autopsy found cyanide in bloodstream, suggesting consumption rather than dermal absorption. Bernie might have dosed a truffle. Grace's watch ticked past midnight. She'd entered dangerous territory. Evidence theft equaled obstruction. But etiquette's first principle was consideration for others, preventing harm. She could not allow a murderer to stroll amid lace napkins. Next morning, Captain Havelock convened staff in the conservatory. Autopsy confirmed oral ingestion of cyanide between 2:15 and 2:30, he announced. We will conduct interviews. Grace requested a private word and presented her notes, the persipan sample, the invoices, the untouched tulip truffle. Havelock's brows rose. Madam Whitfield, you have been industrious. Instructing society teaches one to anticipate misbehaviour, she replied crisply. Havelock dispatched officers to collect Bernie Green, but Bernie had vanished, pickup gone. A bolo was issued. Grace exhaled, yet was unsatisfied. Fugitives often indicated guilt, but absence alone proved nothing. She recalled Bernie's lanky discomfort around people, his pocketed screwdriver like a security blanket. He loved machinery, not finance. Why this complex investment, unless someone forged Bernie's name to redirect suspicion? She requested handwriting samples. The facility logs featured Bernie's blocky capitals. The invoice note bore fluid cursive, different hands. Perhaps Julian himself wrote the note as reminder to speak with Bernie, or as IOU. That redirected suspicion again. Grace rubbed temples. Weary, she returned to the kitchen for chamomile. The refrigerator door was ajar. Condensation trickled. She pushed it shut, then noticed faint footprints in spilled flour near the loading dock. The prints were small, size 6 perhaps, Beatrice's. Adrenaline surged. Grace followed them outside, across gravel, ending behind the herb garden, where a gardening shed crouched like a guilty secret. Inside, Beatrice knelt beside a battered valise. She jumped, eyes shining feverishly. "Madam Whitfield, I—" Grace noted a service revolver from security's armory on a crate. "Looking for something?" Beatrice's shoulders sagged. "Bernie didn't deserve to be framed. I can't let them arrest him." "You framed him?" "No, Julian did, by accident." She inhaled raggedly. Julian owed money everywhere. I mixed cyanide with persipan, hoping the bitterness would warn him off. Just scare him. I intended the poison for a single truffle I'd keep from service. But Julian must have swapped trays while I fetched salt. He ate it himself. Why target him at all? He stole my recipes, my credit, then promised partnership. Yesterday, he told me he'd sell to investors. No room for me. I panicked. Tears streaked flour-dusted cheeks. When he collapsed, I realized what I'd done. I saw Bernie adjust the fountain and he had chocolate on his sleeve. I smeared Persephone on him while helping mop. I thought if suspicion fell on him, I'd have time to run. Grace's core chilled, intent to scare, outcome mortal, manslaughter turned murder by subsequent framing. Her sense of propriety revolted, yet compassion stirred. Desperation warped rational minds. "Put the gun down, Beatrice," Grace said softly. "Violence compounds wrongs." Beatrice collapsed, sobbing. Grace gathered her into an embrace, feeling her coat absorb flour and remorse alike. She dialed Captain Havelock. Later, as police escorted Beatrice away, Bernie returned, bewildered by the commotion. He'd driven to source a replacement gasket. Charges against him were dismissed within hours. The chocolate fountain, draped in white muslin, was removed. That evening, Tulip Hill seemed to exhale. In the library, Grace stared at the rose cordial vial. She uncorked it, inhaled summer of long ago, her father's greenhouse, crimson petals steeping in copper kettles. She poured a thimbleful into 2 crystal glasses, summoned Captain Havelock from paperwork. "To closure," she said, offering a glass. He regarded her with measured warmth. To tenacity. They drank, the cordial blossomed cherry, honey, dusk. Silence settled companionably. "Will the high tea continue next year?" he asked. "Etiquette teaches resilience," Grace replied. "Tragedy leaves a bitter note, but we must blend it with sweetness. Next spring there'll be tea and tulips, though perhaps no fountain." Havelock nodded. "And you, Madam Whitfield, will you continue sleuthing?" Grace smiled over the rim. "Only when manners fail entirely." Outside, moonlight pooled on the dewy lawn. Tulip Hill's windows glimmered like polished silver, sheltering secrets laid bare. Inside, Grace Whitfield, custodian of civility, allowed herself a rare indulgence, relief tempered with sorrow, as bittersweet as chocolate cooling to a delicate snap.